everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and before we delve into tonight's topic, let me make a few public service announcements. First of all, in case you have not been looking ahead on the Jewish calendar, 1 week from today will be Purim. 1 week from tonight will be Purim. So therefore, there'll be no Jewish Destiny series next week because of the celebration and observance of Purim. So we will continue after tonight in 2 weeks. That's our first announcement. The second announcement is that Partners in Cleveland is kicking off its 36-hour, $350,000 annual campaign on Sunday. And this is going to be a virtual campaign. You can go to our website for more information on that, torahcleveland.com. And if you enjoy the Jewish Destiny series and the other things we do, please show your appreciation by contributing to the campaign. But beyond that, if you're located here in Cleveland, we are having a special campaign event live from 6 to 8 p.m. on Sunday, March 13th at Green Road Synagogue. It'll be a shmorg event where the speakers will be myself and Rabbi Levi Burnham from Detroit, Michigan will be coming in to speak as well. And my topic is First They Came for the Ukrainians, a very apropos topic for these days. And Rabbi Burnham will be speaking on the topic of freedom under siege. That event is free. And if you're not with us here in Cleveland or cannot attend live, the event will be streamed right here on TorahAnytime.com. And so you can watch it from the live stream section. The presentations will start at about 6:45 p.m. So you can go to the live stream section on TorahAnytime.com and watch the live stream at 6:45 on Sunday of myself and Rabbi Burnham. Or you can go to our website, torahcleveland.com, where everything will be linked and streaming and all that good stuff. And whether you're here with us in Cleveland and going to join with us in person, or you are somewhere else and going to join with us through the live stream, I look forward to it. It's going to be a great event with some great inspiration leading up to Purim. And with no further ado, let's delve right into tonight's topic, the dark days of Europe, because unfortunately these next, almost the rest of Jewish history is going to be some pretty dark days with some high points and you know, ups and downs. But a lot of the subject matter we are covering tonight is quite dark, as we'll be looking at a lot of the terrible tragedies that took place in the areas of Ashkenazi Jewry during the 13th century. So we're picking up after last week we discussed, in the past few weeks we've discussed the First Crusade, Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, and the trials and tribulations that they had in their lives and the contributions, the tremendous contributions they made to the Jewish people. And so we're picking up essentially after the First Crusade, after the passing of the Rambam. That's what we're going to be delving into tonight, focusing tonight more on what was going on in the world of Ashkenazi Jewry. So with the Crusades, we saw for the first time ever in the Christian world the idea of forced conversion. This was something imported from the Muslim world. The Muslims have been doing it since their conquest in the 7th century. And the Christians during the First Crusade and the subsequent Crusades import this concept for the first time ever. So, you know, when we look at this concept, it's something that originates with the Muslims and makes it over to the Christian world. So this obviously affects the Jewish communities and the Jewish areas that were decimated and persecuted by the Crusaders, but it also affects the Muslims because there was a bigger Muslim population. That was, at least at the core, who the Crusaders were going after. So if you ever wondered where Christian Arabs come from, like for example, Lebanon has a big Christian Arab population, and that's been a lot of the political and religious strife in that country over the past, I don't know, hundreds of years. But that really started now because the Christian Muslims were the Muslims who, at the swords of the Crusaders, decided that they would rather convert than take the sword to the throat or whatever it was. So that's really the beginning of, if you ever wonder where Christian Arabs come from, they come really as a result of the Crusades. And today's Christian Arabs, for the most part, are descendants of those who converted at the time of the Crusades. So even though the First Crusade was a success for the Christians, there were many many casualties. There were about 60,000 people who participated in the First Crusade, and only 15,000 returned to Europe. And after the Crusades, those 15,000 Crusaders, to a certain extent, are on in a good moral mental place because they just conquered back Jerusalem, they conquered back Israel. They've finally taken the Muslims to task for the first time since Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours in the 8th century. And the Christian world sees that this might be the turning of the tide of the Christians reconquering not only the Holy Land, not only Israel, but other parts of the Levant that had been conquered by the Muslims, Spain. We had mentioned before, this will be the Reconquista, the beginning of the Christians reconquering Spain. And, there's a lot of hope in the Christian world that they can put an end to their Muslim foes. So when those Crusaders come back to Europe and they find the Jews in their midst, we had mentioned that the Jews were in many ways in the wrong place at the wrong time with the Crusades, because the initial goal was to get rid of the Muslims, but they took care of their infidel in their midst, the Jews in their midst, as they went along. And after the Crusades, the same thing happens. So this is really the beginning of the end of French Jewry, because the persecution that starts with the Crusades just continues on until the Jews basically will leave France. Now, it's interesting to point out that when we talk about the culture of France and England at this time, with the knights and the squires and Sir Lancelot, though he was probably mythical, but King Arthur and Sir Lancelot and the Round Table, all probably mythical. But that was the culture of the time, and we mentioned before that that's glorified quite often in media and movies and books. But it was basically organized crime, and it's interesting to point out that it was not only in the Christian world, that there were Jewish knights. We have record of Jewish knights as well. So just like there was a Jewish mafia, there were Jewish knights, and was not a new thing in modern times for Jews to be involved in organized crime, because we see even in those days there were Jewish knights, squires, and all that stuff. So when the Crusaders come back to France, they find the Jewish people that's not exactly quiet. If you recall, before the Crusaders, it was a somewhat positive time for the Jews in France, and it was a quick about-face that came about with the Crusades and all this. And the Jews are prosperous people. You have Jews who have castles, and like we said, the Jewish knights, and even famous Jews that are quite wealthy. For example, Rabbeinu Tam, who we mentioned I think 2 weeks ago as one of the grandchildren of Rashi, arguably the main of the Bali Tosos. He was a quite wealthy person. He lived in basically a castle with 100 servants. And, this was not like a very quiet life of the Jews. They just lived in the ghetto and stayed away. They were a very noticeable target for the Christians. And in fact, Rabbeinu Tam himself was almost killed on Shavuos night one year, second night of Shavuos. He was attacked and they tried to forcibly convert him. And he either was taken for dead or rescued by a knight that he knew, whatever it is, and he ends up fleeing his town because of the persecution. So this is really just to show you the atmosphere of what happens in Western Europe at this time, first in France, and we're going to see it makes its way through all of Western Europe, and it really just goes downhill from this point. If you know the story of the famous Rav Amnon, if you don't know who that is, he's the author of the most famous prayer of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Nisana Tokef prayer, where we ask who will live, who will die, some by water, some by pestilence, which really just begs the question, what is pestilence? But if you ever read in the bottom of your machzor the story of Rav Amnon, the story is that he was basically the local bishop gave him the choice of, asked him to convert to Christianity. They actually had a friendly relationship. He asked him to convert to Christianity. And Rav Amnon says, let me think about it for 3 days. And in those 3 days, he becomes so overcome with emotion that he gave such an answer that he didn't just say right away there was no way he would ever convert to Christianity. So after 3 days, he sends the message back to the bishop saying there's no way he's going to convert. And the bishop proceeds to have him dismembered, all of his limbs cut off, until the point where he's finally carried home, bleeding, with no arms, no legs. And before he bleeds to death, he composes the prayer Nisana Tokef, which we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And again, just shows you what the times looked like in France. Now, At this time, we see that the Jews, with all the with everything that was going on in France, they finally give up on France or start to give up on France, and they slowly but surely start to migrate up to England. And this is really or over to the island, I should say, of England. And this is the beginning of the British Jewish community. And the Jews really hope that they will have freedom in England. And initially they do, as happens in most places when we migrate throughout exile. Initially they do have a certain amount of freedom, but we're going to see that, unfortunately, is very short-lived. But it's interesting that when we look at the Tosfos commentary in the Talmud, the commentary of the school of Rashi, the house of Rashi, there were certain of the Baalei Tosfos, most of them lived in France, but some of them lived in England, because we're going to see that the yeshivas open up in England, and many of the rabbis of the time, the Baalei Tosfos, will go up to England. So this is the beginning of the British Jewish community. But really, almost from the beginning, it's in many ways it's short-lived. Now, in 1144, we have the first of what becomes a string of similar events until modern times, and it's crazy when we think about it, and that is the canard of the blood libel. So the blood libel actually takes place in England, in Norwich, England, in 1144. And the story that surrounds the blood libel is that there's a boy by the name of William who was found dead from stab wounds in the woods, and there was a man by the name of Thomas of Monmouth who falsely claimed that the reason he was killed was because every year the Jews get together before Easter, and they basically, Easter in the Christian religion is the holiday where they celebrate what they claim was the day that Yashka was resurrected, that Jesus was resurrected. So what this Thomas of Monmouth, what he claimed is that every year on Easter, the Jews have a council and they select a Christian child to be crucified, to reenact the crucifixion, as if to say that since the Christians were celebrating the day when they say he was resurrected, the Jews go and re-crucify him every year on Easter. So that's a little different than what the blood libel becomes, because the story that becomes a little more popular throughout time is that Jews need the blood around Easter time, but for Pesach, if you never realized before, Easter always falls in very close proximity to Pesach because it's a lunar holiday. It's based on the Jewish calendar, basically. It's based on being 15 days into the lunar month of what we call Nisan, and that's when Pesach is. And they move it to the closest Sunday. But so it quickly switched from Easter to Pesach, that we didn't need the blood through the reenacting the crucifixion, that we needed it because we drank the blood as our 4 cups on Passover, or we put the blood in our matzahs, and that's how it'll eventually evolve as it becomes one of the most famous infamous anti-Semitic canards in all of world history. But it starts here shortly after the Jews get to England. So it's like they go to their new country, they think they're avoiding the persecution of the Crusaders and the aftermath of the Crusades in France, and right away it starts up in England. Now it is important to point out that if we think about more modern, definitely today, but even modern history, the 20th century, for sure after World War I, and even in the 19th century, that England and France are quite different, are quite different countries. They developed into very, very different cultures, very different countries, but in these days, they were not so different. And you regularly had the King of France claiming that he controlled England, the King of England claiming he controlled France. There's even a King of England who didn't speak English, he spoke French. So the countries were culturally much closer together than they eventually become. But again, the Jews still thought they would find solace there, and unfortunately, we're going to see it's quite short-lived. In the year 1147, we have the Second Crusade. Now, the Second Crusade was a response to the fall of the country of Odessa. Now, it's not Odessa in the Ukraine. This is Edessa in modern-day Syria. And this was the first of the Crusader states. Jerusalem was not the only Crusader kingdom, the only Crusader state. This was the first of the Crusader countries, and it was also the first to fall. It fell to the local Muslims in the area, and that sparked the Second Crusade. And we're going to see that there are a plethora of crusades. I believe they're only counted until the number 7, but there's many more after that. And in general, at least for sure with those first 7, or the first 6 after the first crusade, or the next 6, that they're always a response to certain gains that the Muslims have. So the Crusaders, after the crusade, there's these different Crusader countries, and as the Muslims start to take over different municipalities, different areas, that'll spark crusades. So the Second Crusade was to essentially reconquer Syria, or parts of Syria, which had fallen back to the Muslims, and it's a total bust. Actually, you know what? It's safe to say that virtually all the crusades after the first one are a total bust. The first one was successful from a Christian perspective, but the rest of them are just, it's like one bust after another. And the second one was a bust. Very much so, and it paves the way for a new power on the block, and that is a man by the name of Al-Nasr Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. That was his Arabic name. We call him Saladin. We combine his second and third name into one, and we call him Saladin. But his real name, again, was Al-Nasr Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn, which means son of, Ayyub. And he becomes a noted soldier in the different Arab armies, a successful soldier. He has military success. He rises through the ranks of military. Eventually, he becomes the vizier of Egypt. Vizier's like the governor or the president or prime minister let's say governor of a section of an empire. And eventually, he becomes the sultan and expands greatly what is known as the Arabic Empire of the Ayyubid Empire. And he's going to build into quite a force. It's going to conquer much of North Africa. It's going to conquer a lot of territories back from the Crusaders. He's going to conquer Israel. He's going to conquer Syria. He's going to conquer parts of Saudi Arabia. So a good amount of the Levant will end up as part of the Ayyubid Empire. Unfortunately for him, he's going to die of the yellow fever. And shortly after he dies, his empire is going to go with him. And basically paved the way for the Turks to take over the area and form the Ottoman Empire, which will last for quite some time. But be as it may, Saladin becomes the power, rises the ranks of military, has success, and he basically builds on the aftermath of the failed Second Crusade. And a lot of his success just comes at the fact that the Crusaders were falling apart, the Crusader armies and defenses were not successful, and he slowly but surely conquers the areas that we just described, and conquers one Crusader city after another, and like we said, in Syria and in Israel. And the most famous of his battles, where he really deals the death blow to the Crusaders in Israel, is known as the Battle of Khitim. Now, Khitim is an area near Tiberia, near Tiberias, and it's an area called Karnei Khitim because there's two mountains that look like horns going up. And he fights a battle where again, at that time the Crusaders had a lot going for them, but they had made many strategic errors in this battle. But two famous ones is that, first of all, the Crusaders, with all their armor and everything, they weren't so agile, and the battle was in the heat of the late summer in Eretz Yisrael, late summer in Israel, and so they were just, by the time they marched from, I believe, Tiberias to Khitim, they were exhausted, and then they fought an uphill battle. Saladin had mounted himself on top of the mountain, and the Crusaders fought uphill, and we all know from military history, uphill battles are losing battles. That's why they call it an uphill battle. But he totally destroys the Crusader armies at that point, and it goes basically throughout the whole country, conquering essentially every Crusader stronghold, every Crusader city. Now, his goal when he comes to Jerusalem is he doesn't want to conquer Jerusalem through bloodshed, because Jerusalem, to the Muslims, as we've talked about, was a holy city. So he wants to conquer it without bloodshed. He tries to get the Crusaders in the city to surrender. They refuse, claiming that they'll fight to the last man. And so they lay siege to the city, and eventually the Christians within the city of Jerusalem, at that point there's 5,000 Muslims in the city of Jerusalem, and they're being held hostage in the Dome of the Rock. And the Christians threaten to kill those. They're held hostage, not in the Dome of the Rock, but they're held hostage. And the Christians threaten to kill those 5,000 captives and destroy the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque if they're not given a favorable resolution to the siege. So Saladin talks to his advisors, and he agrees. He gives the Christians 30 days to basically become loyal to his rule, to pay essentially a heavy tribute, and if they don't pay that, they can leave the city. And like that, he takes over the city of Jerusalem, putting it back under Muslim rule, which it will stay in the hands of until 1917, when the British will conquer it from the Ottomans. So from the year 1187 until the year 1917, Jerusalem is going to be firmly in the hands of the Muslims. There will be, during I believe, the Sixth Crusade, the Christians temporarily reconquer Jerusalem, but it doesn't last long. The Turks get it right back, and the Turks will be in control of it essentially from after the fall of the Ayyubid Empire until the British in 1917, in the midst of World War I. Okay. Now, why this is significant for the Jews, because you might ask, like, okay, great, so Israel went from the Christians to the Muslims, well, what's that mean for us? It's still not ours. Well, one of the things that Saladin did is the Ayyubids were I hate to use this term, but they were good Muslims. They were not fanatical Muslims. They had decent relationship with the Jews. We mentioned before that Saladin's doctor was the Rambam, and we can speculate that the Rambam had a positive influence on how he dealt with the Jews and how he dealt with the Jews in Israel. But whether that was just the culture of his branch of Islam, or it was from the Rambam, we see that he had a good relationship with the Jews. And when he conquers Israel, when he conquers Jerusalem, he invites the Jews back. And so under the rule of the Ayyubids, the Jews are allowed to return to Jerusalem. They've been kicked out by the Crusaders, live peacefully in the land of Israel. And as we mentioned last week, this is what kind of paves the way for the Ramban to be able to come. And it's small numbers, but this is really the beginning of the Jews moving back to Israel. So from the Bar Kokhba revolts in 135 and the aftermath and the fierce persecution of the Romans, until this point, we'll say it's a downhill trajectory for the Jews in Israel until near extinction, and finally now, in 1187, almost 1,000 years after for sure Jerusalem was almost free of Jews and most of Israel is free of Jews, finally we're going to see that trajectory change and start to head back up slowly at this point, and it'll gain some steam in another 300 years after the Spanish expulsion, gain a little more steam, and then really it'll happen en masse in the 19th century. But I think this is the point where we can look back and say the tides finally turned and the beginning of Jews returning to Israel happened, and it was our good friend Saladin that really paved the way for that to happen. But in the Christian world, it's still nothing but anti-Semitism. So again, we see the difference in the cultures. That the Muslims, okay, we had Muslims we didn't do so well with, but in general we fared much better than Muslims at this time. But it just kept getting worse with the Christians. In 1179, there's a meeting that takes place called the Third Lateran Council to discuss different canons and proclamations that the church was making. And many of them were anti-Semitic. Many of them were specifically against the Jews in Europe. And for example, in the Third Lateran Council, there was a decree made that Jews could not have non-Jews work for them. So that meant if a Jew owned a business, he could not have non-Jews as his subservients. And the houses, we mentioned many servants before, like Rabbeinu Tam, we said had many servants, and many Jews had servants, and you couldn't have non-Jewish servants. So if we were there in that time, we couldn't have if we have non-Jewish housekeepers, you couldn't have them. You had to have Jewish workers. That was one of the canons made. And then there was another one that was very serious, which was that if a Jew and a Christian had a court case, or a grievance really, because you can't call this a court case, but if there was a grievance, the Christian was always believed. In other words, there was no need to bring witnesses, no need to bring proof. If a Christian had a grievance over a Jew, the Jew had no defense. That was one of the canons made by the Third Lateran Council. So things just continued to get worse for the Jews in Christian Europe. 1190 is the beginning of what we call the Third Crusade. Now, this crusade originates out of England, and the main leader of the Third Crusade is someone by the name of Richard the Lionheart, who was King of England. And we see that even though he was king in England, he was hardly ever in England because he loved fighting these wars. And he goes to fight the Third Crusade. Now, what this is sparked by is Saladin taking over everything he took over. It's a reaction to Saladin, and especially to Saladin in Israel. Richard the Lionheart tries to take back Israel. He tries to take back Syria. He tries to take back all these places, and he has minimal success. He basically, in the whole of Israel, Richard Lionheart gets a little strip of land. He wins a successful battle in Jaffa, and he gets a little strip of land, and they make an agreement that unarmed Christian pilgrims can pass freely through the country from that little strip until Jerusalem to visit the Christian holy sites. But what this really means for the Jews is, first of all, you can understand why, even though 3 years earlier the Jews were allowed to return to Israel under Saladin, right away war breaks out again. So we talk about in these times of persecution, like, where do you go? Okay, great, we can go to Israel, but it's like constant war over there, as it will be for the remainder of the 12th and 13th century, with all these crusades and the Christians trying to take it back from the Muslims until the Turks have their firm hold over the country. So there's still the Jews following in the wake of the Crusades with that persecution. But in England, this is another step in the wrong direction for the Jews, because just like in France and in the German Rhineland, we had the Crusaders responding to the Jews in their midst, and the pogroms and the bloodshed. That's what happens in England now, and as a result of the Crusades. So it gets bad. It gets bad. Bad becomes worse. 1215, we have the Fourth Lateran Council, and this is quite similar to its brother, the Third Lateran Council, where there was a whole number of decrees made, anti-Semitic decrees, anti-Semitic canons. There was one that the Jews could not perform extreme usury. Now, what was extreme usury? If you've ever read the book The Merchant of Venice, I don't recommend it. It actually takes place in this time. This is we're in the sort of the time that Shakespeare was depicting in that book. And in fact, yesterday and last night I had the pleasure of meeting and interacting with Dara Horn, who wrote a wonderful book by the title of People Love Dead Jews. I highly recommend it. It is a wonderful collection of essays on just some amazing stories in Jewish history that most of which many of which I didn't know, and really I love her conclusion is that with all this sort of this dark history that we're discussing now, what is a Jew to do? Well, part of what a Jew is to do is she doesn't say this, these are my words. You can't fight it, so therefore we should really do is lean into our Judaism and really find solace in being a Jew and the fact that how beautiful our heritage is. And her response to all this was actually to become a Talmudic scholar, and she learns the Daf Yomi now. Very interesting how she describes in the book. But I highly recommend the book. The history vignettes that she has are tremendous. And she has one all about the Merchant of Venice and describing it's possible. Some try to make an argument that Shakespeare was just reflecting the times, and there were certain pleas for the Jews or plights for the Jews, like Shylock's famous speech. She says no. Shakespeare never met a Jew. This was after we're going to talk about later. The Jews were expelled from England at the time that Shakespeare supposedly lived, and he was just echoing nothing but anti-Semitic canard on purpose. And but the reason I bring this up now is because one of the professions of the Jews during this time period was usury. Now, what's usury? Usury is often translated as money lending, but nowadays we've cleaned it up a little bit and put a suit on it and a tie, and we call it banking, finance. That's really what usury is, because it's lending money on interest, and it's lending money to try and make money. That's banking and finance. That's what it is. But the reason it had a negative connotation in this time is because the Torah as we know, prohibits usury. A Jew is not allowed to lend money to another Jew on interest. And even though most of the Torah was like basically thrown out by the Christians, for some reason that was kept by the Christians, right? Officially, the Catholic Church did not let a Christian lend money to another Christian with interest. So therefore, the way that they kept commerce and finance going in the Middle Ages is they would have middlemen. When a Christian wanted to lend money to another Christian, they would put a Jew in the middle. Now, this is not like today, where interest rates, like if you go to refinance, you can do a 15-year loan at 3% or a 30-year loan at 4%. It was nothing like that. Interest rates were often 30, 40, 50% because quite often you couldn't find the person afterwards. They never repaid. And because you're putting a middleman in it, if the Christian that the Jew is forced to borrow from to lend to the other Christian, let's say charges him 40%, well, the Jew can't turn around and give the same 40%. He has to give 50% because he's got to cover, all his expenses. And because of this, it's not a very positive position the Jew is put in. Again, when we get to the Rothschilds in the 18th century, the Jews will clean it up and deal with it in a more professional way. And Jews are still very much at the heart of finance today in this world. But at that time, it was terrible. So one of the canons that's made by the Fourth Lateran Council is you could do extreme usury, which were these numbers, which was a problem because again, this is one of the only professions a Jew was allowed to do. And okay, in the situation we described before, the first Christian can charge whatever interest rate he wants to the Jew. But the Jew can't turn around and charge that high interest rate to the Christian. So if the Christian's charging him 40%, that's extreme usury. He can't charge that back to the Christian. So it basically took the Jew out, in many ways, out of this profession and made a black market or having to avoid the church. And it was quite difficult for one of the professions that Jews were actually allowed to have at this time. There was a canon that Jews had to wear specific clothing. So this was the beginning of our yellow armbands that we saw, many a times up until World War II and the Holocaust, and or the ghettos before the Holocaust, and this was the beginning of it. The Jews in Christian countries had to wear clothing that would make them distinguishable as Jews, and that did not mean a yarmulke and tzitzis and sheitel, right? It meant armbands, it meant funny hats, it meant different types of clothing based on different countries, and one last anti-Semitic canon that was made is that Jews couldn't hold public office. So from this point forward in Christian states, Jews could not be involved in government anymore. Now, if you remember, we're talking about a time period where in Spain, which is now being reconquered about to be reconquered by the Christians, we had a Jewish prime minister. We had Jews, reach high levels in France. And now we're saying Jews cannot hold public office. So if you start to listen to this Third Lateran Council, the Fourth Lateran Council, it sounds quite similar to the Nuremberg laws and different anti-Semitic codes that we've had from this point until modern days. They're just often repeated, but they are started here at the hands of the church. 1240. We have something. We have an apostate Jew because again, at this time in history, it's kind of crazy to think about it. But we did not only have Jews who were forcibly converted to Christianity. We had Jews who chose to become Christian. And I'm not talking about the Benjamin Disraeli type, the ones who just convert to be able to become part of the British Parliament. No, I'm talking about scholars. I'm talking about rabbis who seem to really believe it. And one of those such characters was somebody by the name of Nicholas Donin. I don't know, it was probably Nehemiah before he converted, then he became Nicholas. So Nicholas Donin, similar to what we talked about last week with the Ramban and his disputation of Barcelona, Nicholas Donin goes to the king, who at this point is King Louis IX of France, and he says that he wants to have a disputation, he wants to have a public debate with the Jews, and the king forces the chief rabbi, Rav Yechiel Peres, to debate with him. So unlike where the Ramban in his debate was given a certain amount of freedom of speech, that's not the case with Yechiel Peres, and there's no guarantees made, but still Yechiel Peres fights a valiant fight, and similar to King James of Aragon in Spain, King Louis IX says, you know what? You made a good argument. If I didn't think your religion was so false, I might even believe you. And so therefore, I'm just kicking you out of Spain, kicking out of Paris. He flees to go to Israel. Unfortunately, dies on the way. And but really, as a response, they saw, as we mentioned last week, they saw the Talmud as really the source the cesspool of the Jews, the source of the Jews' heretical ideas, and therefore King Louis IX orders all of the Talmuds and Jewish books to be confiscated throughout all of France and to be brought outside of Notre Dame to the square, where 24 cartloads of the Talmud and other works are burnt, essentially ending Jewish scholarship in France. Because, again, this is still 200 years before the printing press. Everything was handwritten. It was scrolls. We lost, as we talked about Rashi, we lost a lot of the writings of the Bali Tosfos, and it was a terrible time. In fact, it was such a terrible time that we mentioned this on Tisha B'Av, the great day of Jewish national mourning. We talk about this event of the cartloads of 24 cartloads of the Talmud being burnt in France, in Paris, France. And this is really the end of the French Jewish community. Whatever is left at this point moves to England. We saw in England it's not very good, and start to move east. And this is really the beginning of Jews in Eastern Europe. So really from the destruction of the First Temple, and more so the destruction of the Second Temple, Jews were in Western Europe, Spain, France, Germany. It's about as far as we really record. And we talked again about the Khazars, who did make it a little bit further. But now we see Jews start to move to places like Poland, Russia, Ukraine, these parts of the world, because again, where are you going to go? You couldn't go to Spain. Spain was being reconquered by the Christians. France became non-hospitable. Germany was part of that. England is the same way. So you go east, and that's what we see. The Jews start at this point to inhabit the Slavic countries, the Balkans, and all those areas. So this is where we see the population of Jews start to swell in those areas. 1252 begins the persecution of the Inquisition. We're going to talk about the Inquisition more next week. It's something that deserves a lot more time than we have right now, and therefore not next week, but 2 weeks when we continue after Purim, we're going to talk in depth about the Inquisition, what it was, what it meant, and hopefully do the subject matter the justice it deserves. But what happens in the aftermath of Ashkenazi Jewry as it's starting to literally crumble? It's brought to its knees at this point. All the yeshivas are shut down. The scholarship is destroyed. What happens now? What happens now in the Ashkenazi world as a response to this? So there are basically three individuals that we can look at who save Ashkenazi Jewry at this point. And that is, the first is a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe, who wrote a monumental work by the name of the Or Zarua. Now, the Or Zarua attempted to do something quite similar to what the Rambam did in codifying all of Jewish law, but according to the Academy of Rashi, according to the Bali Tosfos. So, as we mentioned, much of those works had been burnt up. Many of them had not been published in any meaningful way at this point, and so much was lost that he attempted to write down everything that was lost in this book called the Or Zarua. And he was living in Vienna, which was, again, already east in Austria, and that was a place where Jews were not being persecuted. So that's where he fled to. Actually, he was from France, but he fled to Vienna. And in Vienna, he was able to have the solace to write down the Or Zarua, and he traveled throughout Europe, really inspiring Jews not to give up, the Ashkenazi Jewry not to give up, giving them the Or Zarua so they'd have the works of the Bali Tosfos. And he actually had one great accolade that we cannot forget, as he's the first known paid rabbi. So until this point in history, rabbis are not paid. It's not a profession to be a rabbi. And that's why we talk about how, like, the Rambam refused to take money to be a rabbi. He was a doctor, and Rashi was most likely a vintner, and so forth and so on. We talk about all the rabbis throughout Jewish history up until this point, many of which don't seem to be paid to be rabbis, but we see that the Or Zarua was paid a salary. That is recorded. So he's one man through the travels throughout Europe to really build up the Ashkenazi community, trying to give over the heritage of Rashi that was passed down through the Bali Tosfos up until him with his book, the Or Zarua, and he again is one of the three pillars that saves Ashkenazi Jewry at this time. He himself was a student of Rav Yechiel Paris, who we mentioned before from the Great Debate, the Great Disputation, and also of Rav Yehuda Chassid, who we'll maybe get to a little bit later. Okay, so the next of the scholars that really saved the Jewish world at this time is a rabbi by the name of Rav Meir ben Baruch of Rotenburg. Now he is benevolently known as the Maram Rotenburg. Maram is like Moreno Rabbeinu Meir of Rottenburg. Now it's interesting that we're talking about him tonight because his yahrzeit was actually this past Monday, I believe. So it's apropos that we were talking about him tonight. Now what he did was he became an editor of the writings of Tosfos. So whatever he had, whatever he was able to collect, whatever was saved from what happened in Paris, he wrote it in, for the most part, close to the form that we have it today. And he did this on half of the Talmud. So the Talmud has 36 tractates. He gave us the Tosfos as we have it on 18 of those tractates. So half of all of the Tosfos commentary in the whole Talmud is courtesy of Rav Meir of Rotenburg, and again through that, because that was the goal at this time. There was such a golden age of Jewish learning. When terrible times were going on from the Academy of Rashi, from the Tosfos, but it hadn't been organized yet in any way. So the burning in Paris made it look like it could be lost forever. So the book of the Or Zarua was one step in making sure to solidify this Ashkenazi intellectia, so to speak, for eternity. And Rav Meir ben Rotenburg takes that next step in writing down the Tosfos in a way that it could be used as a commentary on the Talmud, on 18 of the tractates of the Talmud. Now, one interesting thing that he did was in his trying to just really encourage the Ashkenazi community at such a terrible time is the canon that we mentioned before, that Jews had to wear the badge or the hat or whatever it was. He said, wear it with pride. And he turned it into a sign of pride, that they're telling you to identify as a Jew, proudly identify as a Jew. And that's what he encouraged Jews to do everywhere that he went. Now, we mentioned before that on Tisha B'Av, we speak about the burning of Paris, and Maram Rotenburg actually witnessed it, and he's the one who wrote the Kina. He's the one who wrote the dirge that we say on Tisha B'Av about the burning of the Talmud in Paris. Now, what was going on at this time in the area that Maram Rotenburg lived? He lived in an area known as the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor was it Roman. It's what controlled this area of the world, Germany, and it's really what ended up being known as the Habsburg Empire. So Germany, Austria, that part of the world at this time, and eventually, as we said, the Jews make it east. They go up from Western Europe to Eastern Europe into this empire that becomes known as the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and of course we see that the anti-Semitism eventually makes its way there as well. And the first emperor of or an early emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was Rudolf the First, and what he did is he made a tremendous taxation and persecution of the Jews, but he made it that the law was there was no limit to how much the Jews could be taxed. So essentially what he did is he turned the Jews into slaves, because there was no limit to how much you can be taxed. They were just taxed exorbitantly, and every penny they earned went to be collected in taxes. So it was a non-sustainable situation. So many Jews flee the not so holy, not so Roman Empire at this time, and Maram Rotenburg himself flees in 1286. And it seems that he was heading for Israel, because at this point Israel is controlled by the Turks. By 1286, the Crusades have basically ended, and there's a certain amount of peace now in Israel under the Turks. The Christians have finally given up on it, and the Jews figured they'd fare much better under the Turks than they would under the Christians. So in 1286, Maram Rotenburg makes his way for Israel, and on his way he is identified by an apostate Jew, by a Jew that had converted to Christianity, by the name of Kneppe, Knepppe is how it's recorded, and he's discovered in Lombardy, Italy, and Kneppe turns him over to the local baron, who turns him over to King Rudolf. And there was as King Rudolf's approach was to extort the Jews for money constantly, it became a business at this time that to take Jews as prisoners and ransom. As we mentioned, similar to in the Sephardic world, how the legend of the four captives that we talked about. So King Rudolf basically takes Maram Rotenburg as a prisoner. He's a prisoner in Alsace, and he puts the ransom as 23 marks. Now that was probably somewhere like $250,000 to $500,000 in modern money, and so an exorbitant amount of money, and in a time when the Jews are already being taxed heavily. And a student of the Maram Rotenberg by the name of Rabbeinu Usher ben Yechiel actually raises the money. But the Maram Rotenberg does something so extraordinarily selfless, and that is that he says, don't ransom me. Don't pay the money. Because, as is recorded in Shulchan Aruch and in the Rambam and in other places, that a Jew is not supposed to pay exorbitant sums. It's actually mentioned originally in the Gemara in Gittin. A Jew should not pay exorbitant sums and extortion because if you, let's say they charge you 23 marks today, they'll charge you 50 tomorrow, and there's no end to it. So the halacha is not to give in. I think back to my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg Zatzal, who was once asked the question about negotiating for hostages with the radical Islamic terrorists, and Rav Weinberg said, we made a terrible mistake after the first hostage situation, going back to the 1970s. Again, talking about modern times. It wasn't the first hostage situation ever, but the first one in modern times, going back to the 70s. He said we made a terrible mistake because what should have been said to those terrorists when they took those hostages for ransom, what should have been said is, kill them, and we're going to kill you too. In other words, the idea of we don't negotiate with terrorists, which we all know is a lie, because America says we don't negotiate with terrorists, and they go on to negotiate with terrorists when there's hostages and discussion. And Israel officially has a policy of not negotiating with terrorists, yet they always negotiate with terrorists. So Weinberg says, had we actually stuck to that policy, and we had just said to the terrorists, we're not paying a penny, kill them or we're going to kill you too, there might have been a second hijacking after that, but there probably would not have been a third. And Maram Rotenberg, with himself as the prisoner, says the same thing. Don't ransom me. Don't ransom me. In 1286, he's moved to house arrest, where he lives out the rest of his life, refusing to let the Jewish community ransom him. Now, after he passes away, he dies in 1293. And after he passes away, there's a man by the name of Alexander ben Shlomo Wimpfen who pays a much smaller amount of money to have his body redeemed, and he is buried in Worms. And as a kavod, as a respect for Alexander, he's actually buried next to him. So if you follow our program Today in Jewish History, like I said, Monday, or I believe was his yard site, you can go back and look at Mondays Today in Jewish History. If you follow the pictures on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn where they appear, we have posted the picture of their tombstones next to each other in Worms. They survived the Germans through the onslaught of Germany, where many Jewish graveyards were sacked and destroyed, and the original tombstones are still there of the Maram Rotenberg, next to Alexander ben Shlomo Wimpfen. So the Maram Rotenberg is personality number 2, who is instrumental in saving Ashkenazi Jewry at this time through the tremendous contribution that he made with the writing of Tosfos as we have it today on half of the Talmud, on half of the entirety of the Talmud. 1290 begins a trend in England that happens almost countless times, and that is the Jews are actually expelled from England. So the Jews are there for maybe a century with hope that they'd have solace there, and it only lasts a century to the point where the Jews are finally expelled. And it's interesting that today the best libraries in the world, the best Jewish libraries in the world, are the Vatican, the Bodleian Library in England, and the Hermitage in Germany, because when the Jews are persecuted and forced to flee these places, they're never allowed to take their books. Again, the scrolls are very heavy, very big, and therefore that's why you have countless Jewish artifacts in the Vatican from all the time and persecution at the hands of the Romans, and the Bodleian Library from all the persecution at the hands of the British, and the Hermitage in Germany from all the persecution at the hands of the Germans. So that's why they today are the best Jewish libraries in the world. The third and final personality who saves Ashkenazi Jewry is the one we mentioned before, Rabbeinu Usher, the student of the Maram Rotenberg who tried to ransom him, who raised the exorbitant amount of money to ransom him. He is the third pillar of Ashkenazi Jewry, and we're going to discuss him more next time because he actually is he crosses over a little bit between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewry, but himself is Ashkenazi. So again, the name is Rabbeinu Usher ben Yechiel, and he is known as the Rush again, Resh Aleph, R-A, Rush, which is from Rabbeinu Asher. And what he gives the Jewish world as a gift of his commentary, where he takes the next step, or really the first step in the Ashkenazi world of codifying Jewish law. So he writes a code according to everything from Ron Rotenberg, from the Or Zarua, and he writes on almost the entirety of the Talmud as a commentary in the back of the Talmud, which again tells us the halacha according to the school of Rashi and the Dvalei Tosfos and everything, and that becomes the second. So he's the third pillar that saves Ashkenazi Jewry, but he's the second of the three rabbis that will become the foundation of what will become known as the Shulchan Aruch. We'll get to that in coming sessions. But so it's really these three men. It's the Or Zarua, as he is known by the name of his famous work. That's a thing that we see, that rabbis are often known by not by their name, but by the famous works that they write. So that we call the Or Zarua the Or Zarua. So the Or Zarua, the Ram Rotenberg, and the Rush are the three rabbis that really save Ashkenazi Jewry and make it that Ashkenazi Jews like me and you are still here today. God willing, in 2 weeks after Purim, we will continue with very dark times. We'll delve into what happens in Spain with the Inquisition and the eventual expulsion, and then make our way to the second half of the 20th century. And I just want to remind you once again, no Jewish Destiny series next week because of Purim. And please, if you are in Cleveland, join us live Sunday, 6 to 8 p.m. For the Shmorg with myself and Rabbi Burnham. If you're not here in Cleveland, come to Cleveland. Free event. It's going to be great. Great food, great Torah. But if you want to tune in virtually, the presentations will begin at 6:45 p.m. on TorahAnytime.com. Go to the live stream section, or you can go to our website, TorahCleveland.com. I wish you all a wonderful week, a Freilichen Purim, a very happy Purim, and God willing, I look forward to talking to you more 2 weeks from tonight. Have a wonderful evening.